Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
August 6th, Lil Baby presents It's Only Us Tour
Made it out the treasure this type of life
at Oakland Arena. Get ready for an epic summer. Lil Baby's IOU Tour has finally touched down. It's Lil Baby live in concert featuring the Kid Glorilla, Glossa, Rilo, Rodrigo, and Honcho.
On the 30 made the forest.
Tickets are on sale now at Ticketmaster.com. Brought to you by Mammoth Live and AG Touring.
Ozcast. Hello world, I'm John Bruni and you're listening to STRATEGIKON, your window to all things security and foreign affairs. Welcome to our 90th episode and the final STRATEGIKON for 2020. I wanted for us to finish strong, and strong we have finished. Today we have chosen to look at a crisis in slow burn, and perhaps to most Australians, a crisis that is well and truly out of sight, out of mind. The Maduro dictatorship in the northern Latin American country of Venezuela. We have looked at Venezuela before with one of our guest speakers, and I thought it was time to revisit this country to find out why we should be paying closer attention to it. In the studio today, we are honoured to be joined from Canberra by His Excellency Mr. Alberto José Mejia Ferrero, Ambassador of Colombia to Australia, and returning guest from Washington, D.C., Evan Ellis, Research Professor of Latin American Studies at the U.S. Army War College Strategic Studies Institute. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Also in our studio is co-host David Olney and producer Tim Whiffen. Greetings to you both.
Greetings, John.
Thank you for having
gentlemen.
I'll open up by asking both our speakers, why should we care about Venezuela?
Well, I can speak from a U.S. perspective, and I can tell you that given that the region is directly connected to U.S. security and prosperity, from a U.S. perspective, Venezuela is just across the Caribbean basin. You have almost 6 million Venezuelan refugees with the collapsing regime, which have flooded out across Colombia and the rest of the region, destabilizing the region, putting tremendous pressures, not only socioeconomic pressures, but impacting crime, impacting health systems and other things. You have Venezuela becoming a point of entry into the region for the sometimes nefarious actions of extra-hemispheric actors, including China, Russia, Iran, and even Turkey. You have basically a situation in which an anti-U.S. regime, which is on top of over 300 billion barrels of recoverable oil, giving it at least potentially an economic basis with which in the past and in the future it could continue to work against U.S. interests throughout the hemisphere. You have a situation in which Venezuela is increasingly becoming a chaotic, ungoverned space, a center for organized crime threats from narco-trafficking, impacting not only the United States, but Europe as it flows across Suriname and into the Netherlands, for example, plus illegal gold laundering, a host to groups that affect Colombia and the rest of the region, such as the ELN and the dissidents of the FARC movement, as well as, frankly, just catastrophic environmental damage being produced both off of the coast of Venezuela as well as in Venezuela itself by both the mismanagement of oil and illegal mining. And frankly, what happens in Venezuela with the illicit groups there impact others, including Cuba as others, as well as, frankly, the politics of the rest of the region, especially the Caribbean, which is strongly impacted by what happens in Venezuela. So it matters quite a great deal to us and to the region of Latin America.
I'm going to speak about from three different perspectives. One, for Colombia specifically, it is a very, very important matter. The negative impact of Venezuela over Colombia is in many dimensions. So our country has been making a very big effort for the past 6 decades to confront illegal groups, criminal gangs, terrorist organizations. We are now in the post-agreement period, the post-conflict period, in which we continue to strengthen our democratic institutions and to continue to move our country forward. But Venezuela plays a vital role in trying to destabilize our democracy, and it really produces very, very damaging influence, not only in the border of Colombia, but internally, and we will speak about later. My second dimension, if I can talk like that, is the very negative impact in the Americas in general, in the region. Not only the Caribbean region and Central America, but expanded in the whole continent. Venezuela has been, for the past a little bit more than 2 decades, supporting illegal groups, supporting illegal activities in the hemisphere, and especially playing a very damaging political role in trying to influence countries, especially countries with very weak economies that for years asked for Venezuela petrodollars in support of, playing a role in favor of Venezuela. And lastly, and talking to why it is important to Australians globally, it is really important for the world to understand that the Americas is a very, very important region. Only Latin America is a huge market of more than 630 million people with a lot of natural resources, with, more things in common to Australia than you can imagine. So preserving democracy, preserving those same principles and values is very important. And as a matter of fact, Venezuela for the last 2 decades has been playing the role of countering democracy, countering this process of consolidation after what you hear of our past, many coup d'etats and many destabilizing processes. Finally, the region was like heading in the right direction, but yes, you have in the middle this very concerning and this very complex, what they call Bolivarian revolution that has played, in my opinion, a very regressive role in the Americas and in the world in general.
Alberto, a question for you on the basis of, decades of moving towards stabilizing democracy in South America, more effectively building economies, looking to interact with the rest of the world. When people talk about, sort of the Russian and Chinese and Iranian and Turkish involvement in Venezuela, how then do do countries like Colombia and other South American countries, then interact with these powers when they turn up and go, well, here in Venezuela, we've got access to cheap resources. So do they then reach out to places like Colombia as well and say, well, while we're here buying, oil, can we buy mineral wealth from you? Or is it very much a case that Venezuela is being exploited, and in doing so, it's reducing the ability to interact, with sort of, foreign entities, big states?
A very, very complex and difficult question. I'm sure Evan can really give me a good hand here, because, you can imagine my role as Colombian ambassador don't allow me to speak about other countries, as you can imagine. But I'm going to tell you this. Venezuela for decades was a democratic country, a very rich country. As a matter of fact, it was the main commercial partner of Colombia. So, and I study in the U.S., as a matter of fact, in the U.S. Army War College and the U.S. Army Command General Staff course with Venezuelan officers. And they were exactly like us, the same type of democracy with all the good and bad things, just trying to move forward, of course, with problems like corruption and things like that. But since this revolution was created, they really tried to export this socialist approach into the region. During the first decade of this movement, I mean from 1998 to 2013, when Chavez died, they tried to influence with resources in Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and many other countries, not only politically speaking, but socially, and even trying to for example, to use, for example, the national education systems in trying to promote the revolution in those countries, supporting leftist approaches, communist approaches, and things like that. So, but at the same time they were doing this, you have these other external presence there, helping in different ways. In some cases, just a commercial relationship. In some others, an incredible military influence. You can, for example, you cannot understand, I just want to be very clear, for example, with an Australian listening to this, how, for example, this regime was able to invest close to $40 billion worth of military hardware equipment, the latest technologies, but today they don't have anything to eat. They don't have democratic institutions. They completely destroy one of the richest countries in the region. So yes, they have their saying, but there was external influence, of course. And let me tell you, I was reading Evan's recent papers, and I agree with you, Evan, that you know, by breaking their institutions, the regime is just more fragmented, and every day, every month they're getting closer to their collapse. And as you can imagine, COVID-19 is not really helping their purpose.
If I could,
Sorry, go on.
If I could jump in and say just a few things, especially maybe going as a academic beyond what Ambassador Mejia can say. First of all, with respect to external actors, it's important to differentiate actors such as Russia and Iran, and to a certain extent Turkey, from China. So it's a little bit more clear cut. For example, when you look at Russia, so for Colombia, at least before the most recent stage, when Colombia looked at some of the threats that came from the Maduro regime in Venezuela, and some actually historically, although Colombia and Venezuela are basically brother countries, maybe the best parallel would be Australia and, for example, New Zealand. So difficult to think, but having a regime in Venezuela that in many ways was challenging and undermining. But even beyond that, for example, the Sukhoi 30 fighters that were sold to Venezuela, which were perhaps one of the biggest immediate threats during times of tension, could reach in a matter of minutes the Ministry of Defense in Bogota, for example. Colombia looking at Russia selling those types of things, or massive quantities of tanks and armored vehicles that Colombia just didn't have the type of military that it was matching, because Colombia's defense needs were very different. And so I think, and also as Colombia looked out at Russian engagement elsewhere. I mean, Colombia looked out across, for example, the Atlantic, and it saw itself increasingly surrounded to its east. Russia-armed, Russia-enabled Venezuela. It would look, at one point in time, it looked to its south at a very friendly Russian relationship with the populist regime, at least previously in Ecuador. It looked across the Caribbean and saw, hostile engagement with Russia in Cuba. It looked to the northwest and it saw, Russian engagement in Nicaragua, including that presented a threat to the water space around a very important island, which is a territorial claim of Colombia's. So when you look at Russia, it was a little bit more clear the way in which there was a threat. Indeed, in various occasions, I think one of the most recent major violations was 2013, when basically nuclear-capable Tu-160 Russian bombers actually violated Colombian airspace, basically to make a point. And so with some of these regimes, I think it's a little bit more clear. In the case of China, it was more complicated, and perhaps it's not unlike what Australia has to deal with China telling companies like BHP Billiton and other big Australian-based companies that it's a friend, it's a business partner, and yet actively in things like espionage and education and undue political influence, doing things that also seem to directly challenge and undermine Australian sovereignty. And so you have a situation in which in many ways, it was $64 billion of Chinese loans in the early days that helped enable and empower a lot of the nefarious activities that Hugo Chavez was doing until things really started falling apart. And yet, at the same time, you also had Colombian business elites who were interested in the money that China could provide to, as export markets for Colombian goods. And so it's a complicated relationship, but I think China is careful to be less overtly an adversary that threatens Colombia versus the way in which countries such as Russia have behaved.
So very much the classic, catch-22 that Australia's in. You need the business, but with the business becomes the political threat.
Exactly. I mean, it's you have a business who look at the possibility of Chinese investments in whether it's in the Colombian Llanos or in the modernization of the port of Buenaventura, or in manufacturing enterprises such as the Photon factory outside of Bogota, and so there's lots of individual interest that makes it tempting to compartmentalize and forget that China is also doing a lot of other things in other places that undercut the interest of Colombia. So it's and China plays it very carefully not to ally itself explicitly against Colombian interests, and that makes it very hard to define the threats in that way.
Just on that alone, I'm curious as to labor laws and how do local people within Colombia and in the Venezuelan space, they're accepting Chinese investment, but obviously the Chinese will come with their own view of how things ought to be done. Are labor laws, local labor laws in Colombia and in other parts of Latin America compatible with Chinese levels of investment, or are the Chinese trying to put their own view of what ought to be paid for by anyone?
I have some things to say, but Ambassador, do you want to start?
No, yes, I just want to say that if you look at the numbers of Chinese presence in Latin America, you will find out that their investment is one of the lowest in the case of Colombia. They have become a first trade partner to many other countries in Latin America. That is not the case of Colombia, especially because we have a very strong and strategic relationship with the United States. So we think we are different. Of course, in recent years, they have been, as our government has been trying to and it's part of the effects and the impact of the peace agreement, our government trying to stabilize and reconstruct our infrastructure, trying to reach to regions that for decades were in the middle of conflict. Of course, we are now open for international investment, and we support that. We tend to do that, and we have this open and democratic processes in which global companies can apply. For example, just to mention, Bogota City finished the last 2-3 years this open auction for the Bogota Metro, and many companies, even U.S., European, global companies apply, but at the end, a Chinese conglomerate won this bet. So yes, it is a more open and commercial presence, but at this point, I don't see within Colombia any approach, any tendency for people to see this as a problem, as a threat, as a difficulty. Right now, for the first time, Colombians are beginning to see, and this is like the other side of the coin, these more than 2 million Venezuelans now living in Colombia, being forced to go out of Venezuela, making a very big presence in urban areas, but especially playing an incredible burden, for example, for our health system, education system, security system, etc. So Colombia is really paying millions and millions of dollars in support this humanitarian crisis. President Duque has been, very, very strong in trying to confront this with different strategies, and of course, is difficult, it's complicated. But to mention that for the first time, I can see now Colombians, for the first time, seeing Venezuelans, these migrants, with a different eye, with a different, worry about their presence, competing for these very scarce resources. As you can imagine, our economy was doing very well pre-COVID, post-agreement, but now, at the end of this very difficult pandemic, our economy, of course, is struggling, and now the government has to comply with, they have to be very creative in creating these strategies, not only to tackle the problems of the past and to comply with the peace process demands and agreements, but at the same time to try to support these Venezuelans. So this is the first time that I see Colombians like worrying about people from other countries, people from outside our borders.
With respect to the Chinese involvement, I think it's important to make a good distinction. China behaves in very different ways in countries with strong institutions and laws versus countries where it can do government-to-government deals and get authorization from, the leaders to act as it wishes. And so it's interesting, if you look at Colombia, in general, Chinese companies have made limited progress, but in the context of Colombian laws, and Colombia actually takes a great deal of pride in their laws. So, for example, it was interesting as the telecommunications company Huawei expanded in Bogota and elsewhere, and had to integrate itself and conform itself to Colombian labor laws, including the hiring of young Colombian professionals and things like that. And I actually talked with a Huawei manager a couple of years ago who said one of their biggest difficulties was, finding that integration. Another important point is that in a place like Colombia, where you do have difficult procurement laws, that actually did restrict some of the public Chinese projects. But what China is doing increasingly in Colombia and even in Chile now is it's beginning to adeptly use public-private partnerships. So, for example, one of the first major highway infrastructure projects was under what the Colombians call the 4G highway program. I believe it goes from basically Medellin up to the Gulf of Urabá, and I believe that there are certain PPP components of this major win in the metro. And for all Colombians, just the idea that a metro is going to finally get built in Bogota is a great accomplishment. But that's another story. But it's interesting that in Venezuela, some of the abuses that have actually taken place, involving Chinese companies, it's been a very different story. And frankly, the billions of dollars that the Chinese actually put into Venezuela, and it all basically being robbed in one way or another. And there's almost nothing to show for it. Not the money that was loaned for the thermoelectric plants, not for the money that was put to upgrade the Guri Dam, not for the money that was put in for various agricultural projects, not for the money that was built for the Cherry car factory, not for the money to build 2 cell phone plants. Basically the Chinese and the leftist populists basically, split the money and left the people with nothing. And so I think Colombia's institutions have allowed Colombia to get a better deal from China, although there frankly have still been problems. And the other thing, just to second what the ambassador said, try to imagine any country, again, maybe Australia, New Zealand is the best, parallel, but other countries, Venezuela used to be a place where Colombians would go, because of the prosperity in the oil days of the 70s and 80s. And now that things have reversed, but almost unthinkable, 2 million Venezuelans coming through Colombia, impacting public insecurity, impacting health systems, impacting, crime. And so in a way, try to imagine in a country with relatively small, having 2 million people come through your country and have them welcomed with open arms. And in many ways, what the Colombians done is it's remarkable. I think it has, but as with anything, I mean, there are limits in what the Colombians, with the many other problems, can really stand with the crisis in Venezuela.
I'm curious with regard to opposition leader in Venezuela, Juan Guaido. The Trump administration attempted to support him, but these moves failed spectacularly. Can you gentlemen please help the Australians? Yeah, help the Australian audience understand what went so badly wrong. Yeah.
I'll begin with this. So first of all, the legal basis, it was actually very solid and in many ways very astute from legal scholarship. And that was that the previous Venezuelan presidential elections were in clear violation of their constitution. And without getting into the detail, basically when Nicolas Maduro came to the end of his only legitimate period in office, the Venezuelan constitution said that if the president ends his term and there is no legitimately elected president, then basically it goes to the head of parliament until a new leader can be. So obviously this was not a constitutional provision that was intended for this purpose, but once you could clearly establish that there was not an election that had occurred legitimately by the Constitution for a second term, then the question was the person who, I believe it was January 5th, was elected as the head of parliament, Juan Guaido, according to the Constitution, became the leader. And so in many ways, it was to the credit, I think, of the Trump administration and many others in the region that they kind of jumped on top of that and very rapidly coordinated with our European and partners in the region to have, I think in the end, 57 countries recognizing Guaido. But what basically happened is you had a clear de jure versus de facto situation because, frankly, the problem was that, that for really, Guaido had a very weak hand to play because you had a extensive penetration of Cuban intelligence in the Venezuelan military, because there had been extensive corruption at all levels in the Venezuelan National Guard and in the military and the leadership of Chavismo. There was basically a fear that if they were to lose power, they would not just lose their illegitimately gotten gains. They would be subject to, prosecution. There were enough people who had jumped ship and had been subject to prosecution, Interpol red noses and things like that. It was kind of understood that, we can't risk losing power. And so basically what happened is that, again, with the help of the Cubans who were keeping an eye on everyone, it was kind of like a Russian standoff, that as much as the economy was falling apart, as much as Guaido could make constitutional arguments, as much as the U.S. could impose sanction after sanction after sanction, there was the sense of almost like bank robbers being holed up in a bank robbery and hostage situation gone bad. Everyone had their guns on everyone else, but no one wanted to risk going out the door. And so in that situation, basically what you had was that little by little the situation, the sanctions, the oil economy fell apart. But perhaps the critical thing is on the one hand, you had a Maduro regime that was willing to basically destroy the entire economy and have Venezuelans flee to Colombia and elsewhere out of just abject, poverty and lack of options. And when they fled, that was that many people less that, Maduro had to take care of. And so even with the oil revenues rapidly going to zero, frankly, there was enough money coming in through, Venezuela very quickly became a narco-criminal state with the leadership of not only the Venezuelan military, but with Maduro elites, many of whom have not only been sanctioned, but have been indicted by the U.S. Department of Justice and others. But what happened then is, again, you were getting all of this narco money coming in from basically where the drugs would previously go out of Colombia up through the Gulf of Urabá or elsewhere. Now there were new routes that would actually come in through Venezuela and then out of Venezuela, making lots of money for the Venezuelans there. There was an explosion in the illegal gold economy. In other words, you had, with the help of other countries like Iran and Turkey, among others, basically the extraction and taxing and the laundering of Venezuelan gold. There was the extortion of remittances. So preying on the Venezuelans who had gone to Colombia to work, they were trying to send back money and care packages, and basically sometimes as much as 4/5 of those care packages would be robbed at the border, and part of those proceeds, it all went to supporting the illegitimate economy. And so the economy was almost being held hostage. And so as long as there is enough illicit money going to Maduro's people, and as long as the military wasn't broken, it was a very, very hard nut to it was a very, very hard nut to crack. And so I'll leave it at that point. I mean, there's more detailed explanation, but it certainly wasn't for a lack of trying. I mean, I had the privilege of working with some of the people when I was at Department of State, Special Representative Elliott Abrams' team, Deputy Assistant Secretary Philip Petty. There was day in, day out, constant thinking and creative thinking and coordination and a very fluid, positive relationship with the Guaido team and his representatives of, what can we do? And frankly, they all have my greatest admiration. They played an impossible hand about as well as they could have played. Say what you say, it wasn't for lack of trying.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Evan. And my government, President Duque, is one of the biggest supporters of this approach, this strategy that has been very, very difficult to play. But I want to mention that all of this doesn't, and especially for Australians listening to this, all of this doesn't, come up in a vacuum. I mean, in the past 2 decades, a very brief explanation, half of that first decade, President Chavez, he was, of course, a populist, very well known and very loved by the people, a very charismatic leader. So he, did everything possible in his reach to produce this regime change, to drastically change their constitution, their institutions, their political parties, their social establishment, their economy. So he was really an incredible architect for bad in taking a democratic structure and changing completely. But when he was finishing that, he dies. And Maduro got into office in 2013 with a very big difference. He's not a charismatic leader. He is not a well-educated person. He was not surrounded by people, at least with the limited knowledge to continue to maintain and project their institutions. And at the same time, for the first time, oil prices going down, and they were, losing incredible resources, because one thing is for you to project revolutionary projects when you have oil prices up here, and one other thing is to do the same thing when oil prices are down. So Maduro got into the regime with his economy going drastically down, but with one very important change. Chavez was able to change the mindset of his armed forces. And this, to me, has an incredible impact, because I knew very well the armed forces of Venezuela. They were, trained in the U.S. As Colombia, they follow U.S. doctrine and U.S. Army and U.S. Armed Forces structure and things like that. So we were partners and we played together. We did operations in our borders. We fight against narco trafficking and against terrorist activities in the border and so on. But 10 years after the influence of Chavez, they became 100% politicized. They became 100% members of a revolution. They leave behind the idea of protecting the constitution, protecting the laws, protecting, the good for the people of Venezuela, and they changed that and became just members of a party. So this past decade, Maduro has been using them. They are like the common denominator for this equation, because they are the ones sustaining the regime. The regime has no political rivals. He has destroyed political institutions. Their electoral institutions are completely taken by them. Their economy completely destroyed. They created all kinds of subsidies that at the end stop completely their economy, because the people, they are not willing to work, they are not willing to do anything, because everything is for free. Imagine, for example, John and David, that that, and Evan know this better than me. For example, in Venezuela, the price of gasoline is almost zero. So in Colombia, for example, the price is at international prices. So imagine the struggle in that border when on your side you have almost for free gas, and on the other side you have international prices. So imagine just the illegal markets, the criminal activities there. And recently, Evan published a very important book about transnational crime. So this is like the best ground for transnational crime, because you can find there all kinds of activities. So Guaidó got into this final part of a demise of democratic institution of Venezuela, and it is very difficult. Without those institutions, without the support of the military, it is quite complicated. But all these governments supporting Venezuela, even the government of Australia, politically and diplomatically are very important, because at the end of the day, they are sending a very tough message to the regime. They reject what they propose. They reject their destruction of democratic institutions, and hopefully this will change sooner than later.
Yeah, first of all, I thoroughly agree with everything that the ambassador said, especially about basically the use of military career paths and doctrine changes and things to completely replace what really was once one of the first-rate, finest militaries in the region. But beyond that, I also wanted to add, among other things that have helped to keep the Maduro regime in power, while at the same time prejudicing the Colombians, just shows the interdependence. As the Venezuelan economy deteriorated, and of course as criminality took over, as oftentimes happens with just corrupt mismanagement, you had a problem in the interior, in that as illegal mining was taking off, you had what they used to call the syndicates, the sindicatos, and others who were a little bit unruly in the way that they would run the interior. And there were a lot of different dirty deals. But of course, you had these two revolutionary groups that Chavez and Maduro had long permitted on the Venezuelan side inside the border that threatened Colombia, the ELN and the FARC, which later we were talking about the distant parts of the FARC. And so especially the ELN, Maduro had a problem. He needed to put order in the interior of the country. He needed to create a buffer if other actors would come in. And so there was evidence, and this may not be something that the ambassador can say on behalf of the Colombian government, but strong evidence for those of it who follow it, that basically the ELN was invited actively into the interior of Venezuela to help Maduro out by basically putting order to the criminal enterprises so that they would serve Maduro and generate money for Maduro. But the net result is you now have basically, under these active support of Maduro, these groups that are trying to overthrow the Colombian government now having a place where they can raise money, recruit, hide their ill-gotten gains, and then continue to project those resources back into Colombia, as if Colombia didn't have enough problems. And so there's a synergy between the problems of Venezuela and the threat to Colombia, frankly.
I'm just curious now with the incoming Biden administration. I mean, what's this going to mean for Venezuela and Latin America generally? I mean, is Biden soft on Latin America? Was there a sense or perception, at least, that Trump was strong in Latin America? Although I suppose if you spoke about Mexico, you could take that whatever way you want.
Episode, I don't think we've got enough time for Mexico.
No. But I mean, I was just being facetious here. But in terms of how Biden is positioning his State Department team, is there a sense of bipartisanship between the outgoing Republican Party and the incoming Democrat Party with regard to American policy in Latin America?
Sure, no, great question. So first of all, Biden himself, by his records and by his experience in dealing with Latin America, which is very significant as vice president to Obama, he always positioned himself as relatively conservative. We probably can expect there will be some attention, and this is consistent with Democratic, small d, policies in general, perhaps greater attention to abuses that are committed by armed forces, perhaps a desire to take a different tack in terms of the way one deals with Venezuela. For example, the technical issue of, are sanctions and the use of OFAC and Treasury the most appropriate vehicle? Are there other ways to negotiate? But in a broader sense, with respect to the incoming team, now the Latin America specific elements of the team, especially, for example, who's going to be the Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere and State, those choices have not been made explicit yet. However, if you look at people, for example, such as Anthony Blinken, who's going to be the Secretary of State, he was the number 2 guy at State before. He knows intimately how that bureaucracy works. And so I think he's going to come in day one, not only prepared to, knowledgeable, but prepared to use that bureaucracy and the professionals with whom, frankly, I had the pleasure to work as well in a very productive way. The same thing with our national security advisor, who's going to be coming in, Jake Sullivan. He actually was the head of my old organization, the Office of Policy Planning. And so he understands not only NSC, but the relationship between NSC and state and treasury and others. And frankly, that sounds a little bit like insider baseball, but I can tell you firsthand that relationship, when you're working these day-to-day interagency issues, how do you coordinate with treasury? How do you coordinate with defense? How do you coordinate with the intelligence community to pull it all together? That knowledge is critical. So I think you're going to have a difference in emphasis, perhaps a difference in shade. I think, frankly, people like Maduro and the Cubans and others are going to test Biden early on. And there could be, again, differences in style, but I think you're going to find a relatively effective response, one that works through existing institutions. And I don't think you're going to see a Biden administration walking away from, if even, for example, Michelle Bachelet, in Chile and now head of the UN Commission on Human Rights, recognizes what appears to be war crimes that were committed by the Maduro regime. Say what you want about if you're on the left or right, but it's hard for me to see the Biden administration walking away from, for example, criminal indictments from our Department of Justice against Maduro and his family. Those aren't just, we don't like you. These are, we found evidence that you are actively engaged in wrongdoing. So I don't think that those things are going to go away in the, but again, it's the other team's turn at bat. So, I welcome and wish them the best in this very difficult problem.
In the case of Colombia, is very, very important to say here that our relationship with the United States is of incredible strategic importance. We consider Colombia to be the closest partner in the region to the U.S. We have been working together, and as a matter of fact, during my whole military career, I had the opportunity to work together with U.S. military, U.S. institutions, and they play a very important role in rescuing Colombia's democracy from collapse. Our country only 2 decades ago was, very, very close to collapse because of the presence and the influence and the destruction created by FARC and other terrorist groups. So since we were able to create a bipartisan strategy, Republicans and Democratic parties supporting Colombia through what is called Plan Colombia, we were able not only to strengthen our military institutions, but also democratic institutions in general. Investments, for example, in our judiciary were very, very important, in our prison systems, and in other areas, economic areas, what we call today integral action in support of the people in very far locations of Colombia. That is very important. And we consider ourselves partners with the US and other close friends in rebuilding, reconstructing, and rescuing Colombia from that very difficult abysm. Just to mention this, imagine that only 15 years ago, we have around the city of Bogota, the capital of Colombia, 22 FARC fronts surrounding the city. The city was almost kidnapped. Today, you have zero tourists all around Bogota and the department of Cundinamarca, which is the department in which Bogota is located. So for us, this relationship is very important, and we don't want the relationship to be politicized. We want the Republican Party and the Democratic Party to continue to work together in this approach in support of Colombia. It is because of this approach that we became, for example, our armed forces, global security partners of NATO. It is because this approach in support of the US that we have been training military and police forces in the Caribbean, in Central America, and even in South America. So just by working together, we were able to change this. And that is what we want to achieve when we talk about Venezuela. What we don't want in Venezuela, we don't want, as our president has said so, we don't want a war there. We don't want a major war to change the regime in Venezuela, because the impact of this over Colombia could be more dramatic than what we have today. We want to continue to use this political, diplomatic, and economic pressure in order to support U.S. strategy in the region, but also to support other Latin American countries, such as, for example, the Lima Group, in support of this approach towards Venezuela.
If I could, I just wanted to, first of all, second what the ambassador has said. There are few, if any, partnerships with the United States in the region that are as close as the one that we've had over these years with Colombia. And also to second what he said, for example, what we know is exporting security. Actually, the collaboration with Colombia to help do security collaboration and build up institutions in other parts of the world, like Central America, where the Colombian military has particular capabilities and linguistic capabilities that complement ours, as well as the fact that Colombia is working towards, as basically one of our most significant non-NATO partners, basically working toward a relationship, again, is almost basically a NATO compatible relationship. But I suspect, and again, I say this as an academic, that as always happens in politics, that I'm sure our Colombian partners are worried about what comes next, what comes after Plan Colombia, what comes when the money runs out, what comes with the new administration, especially, when politics change. But also, as the ambassador knows, if there's any reassurance at the fact that Plan Colombia itself was actually put together, under the Clinton administration by a Democratic administration, and actually sustained during the most of its period by Democratic administrations. And so I think, as with Venezuela, the fundamentals are not going to change for the U.S. with Colombia.
David, two questions, gentlemen, and you can have a go at whichever one, or both have a go at both. First thing, from Australian perspective, we're so much a multilateral country that I know a lot of our listeners are going to be wondering what sort of multilateral mechanisms are in place in Latin America to help with the refugee crisis and to help spread the burden. And the second one thing is more a question from my own specific interest, and that is, I've done a fair amount of reading and lecturing on security sector reform in Africa. And I know there's been lots of security sector reform in Latin America as well. And it seems to me that when eventually change happens in Venezuela and there's sort of a new day, that a very big part of that is going to have to be, major security sector reform to undo the damage from the Chavez period onwards of politicizing and deprofessionalizing the Venezuelan military. So either of you can have a go at either question or ignore either question, whichever you would prefer.
Well, I'm going to start this time, Evan. So talking about a multilateral approach, President Duque has been very active in working with the Lima Group in trying to put together a more Latin American approach towards this program of Venezuela. Of course, organizations like the Organization of American States, the OAS, has been very, very vocal and very influential in trying to not only support this approach in support of President Guaido and in general in support of a democratic Venezuela, but more important than that, in trying to explain to the world what was happening there. Of course, UN refugee programs and US programs, European Union programs in support of refugees and migrants have been having some presence there, especially US. But let me tell you that it is my opinion that this crisis, this refugee crisis, this migrant crisis has not received the treatment that you see of a crisis like this, for example, in the North African region, in the Sub-Sahara region, and things like that. In this case, the burden for Colombia is very heavy. Imagine this. Let me mention this. For example, we have really more than 2 million Venezuelans in Colombia. Some people said the numbers are double like it could be 4 million. But for example, these people, they're getting into Colombia, for example, and they haven't, pre-COVID, they weren't vaccinated for the last 10 years. Colombia is paying for the education of all these children. Every single Venezuelan woman that is having their babies, our health system is paying for that. And you can keep counting and imagine the burden of this. So we need the support of institutions. If you put together the investment, for example, for the Syrian crisis versus the Colombian crisis, the difference is huge. So we need to be able to attract more resources, and perhaps we need to really to create a stronger strategic communications approach in order to explain this in a better way to other countries, because we need that help, and because if this continues and as the regime continues to go down, this is only going to worsen. So that is a great concern for us. And your question about security sector reform in Venezuela, of course, that part of that reconstruction of Venezuela, that is one of the most important topics. When we together, the good partners and the good democratic countries of Latin America and the world get together and finally decide to support the reconstruction of Venezuela after Maduro, this topic will be one of the top in the agenda, because, as I mentioned before, they became very corrupt, very politicized. You even have the cartel of the sons as part of their institutions. Imagine generals and colonels and mayors and a specific chain of command supporting these illegal activities with cocaine, with gold, and with different mining products is incredible. So yes, that is going to be important. And let me mention, for example, the Colombian approach, because imagine this, Evan, every single day we have very difficult situations in our border. And our forces, they have been very professional, because we have to treat these very single tactical problems with, being very careful, with high standards, with specific techniques in order not to create, a huge problem, because in many cases that is what Maduro wants to create in the border. But in our case, we believe that our transformation is producing that a more professional military, investment, millions of dollars in better education and professionalization. So when and that you can actually do a parallel. When they invest millions of dollars in air defenses, in tanks, in the latest fighters, etc., we on our side decided to have a very disciplined military, highly educated, reaching to NATO standards, close than ever to the US and to the US military. And that is our approach, because we believe that by doing that, as Professor Huntington mentioned in one of his books, The Soldier and the State, we become more professional, and the civil and military relations get stronger. So imagine that is what's happening now during the post-conflict in Colombia. We continue to go forward, but our government, the civilian society, and the military are together for the good of the country. In the case of Venezuela, the Maduro regime has left behind the whole society and is only working with the military to maintain that very undemocratic regime.
Alberto, if I could ask, since arriving in Australia, Do you think that we pay as much attention to Latin America as we should, or do you think that there's a deficit there?
John, look, part of my mission is to being able to explain that. And as a matter of fact, I want to use this opportunity to thank Australia because they supported something very dear to my heart, which is humanitarian demining in Colombia. As a result of the peace process, we created this fantastic brigade of 7,000 strength to do humanitarian demining. And you know, many of these mine detectors detect soldiers that they are using Australian equipment and Australian resources. We are working together with civilian NGOs to produce this change. But if you ask me, the knowledge is very limited. Here, of course, and I understand, I respectfully understand that, but their center of their vision is the Indo-Pacific. We are also part of the Pacific, but Australia, normally they see only the Pacific, only like half of the Pacific, not the other side of the Pacific. So of course, we want to change that. And really, now that you are having these frictions and these tensions post-COVID, especially with China in the region, that now, in my opinion, respectfully again, it is the time to reach to Latin America. It is the time to reach to countries like Colombia. Of course, Australian presence has been growing in Colombia. For example, in the past 2-3 years, 88 new Australian companies investing in Colombia, but the opportunities are there. Colombians are beginning to understand that. Our government is investing, millions of dollars in education. For example, we have now more than 20,000 Colombian students studying in Australia. Evan, they feel safer here than in other places of the world, not to mention the US. So that is very important. The relationship is moving forward, but the idea of seeing there for business, for trade is very important. Australia, because of his insular DNA, tend to be a little bit protective. For example, the standards that you exercise, for example, for Colombian products like flowers or fruits, are completely different than the standards being applied, for example, for a country equally prestigious like Japan. So imagine we can do many things with Japan at their standards, but those standards cannot apply for Australia because of their biosecurity, high level things. So it is in my opinion, we want to have a two-way approach. President Duque is working very hard in this free trade agreement through what is called the Pacific Alliance. Colombia last week became the pro tempore president of Pacific Alliance. It's the union, the economic union of 4 very powerful countries: Mexico, Peru, Chile, and Colombia. I really believe that is the approach, that is the mechanism that we need to push forward in order to have a stronger relationship, and in order to close this very cynic geographical distance. We need to build the bridges to get together. It's easy to say, but very difficult to achieve.
Yeah, obviously. David, last question?
Just, Evan, if you would like to jump in on security sector reform from your experience, because I think it's something Australians don't really understand, how important it is to get past problems and the extent to which countries like the US and Australia have provided support across the world, and how big a part of stabilization and rebuilding it can be.
Absolutely. And if I could just also complement something that the ambassador said with respect to the refugees. Multilateral entities like the OAS and certainly less the Lima Group just do not have the structures to actually deal with refugees in a multilateral fashion. And as the ambassador rightly said, the money the lack of money is astounding. The degree to which this has been basically put in the hands of the Colombian state without the help, without even the resources that, for example, the Europeans have when they receive Syrian refugees. I literally understand that the per capita refugee spending is like 1 in 7 or 1 in 10 if you compare what's spent on Syrian refugees to what's spent on Venezuelan refugees. And again, the Colombians have to support that. And again, as the ambassador said, with respect to things like COVID, it's not just the impact on educating and normal health, but it's difficult to imagine a way in which Venezuelans could have basically been made to present more serious health risks. Basically traveling across Colombia and the rest of the region in weakened conditions, oftentimes forced to live in very unsanitary, crowded conditions. But then when the world shut down because of COVID, those Venezuelans who worked largely in the informal sector couldn't find jobs. So they came back, oftentimes again, walking days back through Colombia, where they had to cluster and wait on the Colombian side of the border because they were, again, in crowded conditions in places like Cúcuta, trying to cross over. Then they were forced to live in crowded conditions on the Venezuelan side of the border. They stayed in Venezuela for a while, still couldn't find work. Now they're coming after all of that. I mean, try to imagine a better way to assure that you actually catch the virus than coming back into Colombia. So the risks to Colombia are just enormous. With respect to security reform, so first of all, I can tell you that the Guaido government, with the support of others, have actually very, very good detailed plans for what they would do on the economic front and oil, and that includes with respect to military reform. Obviously, it will take time, will take resources. I've seen the plans. I can tell you that they're pretty detailed. The thing that most worries me, though, is the fact that it's almost, the situation is almost wired that when it comes apart, it's hard to imagine being more messy. In other words, try to imagine a contested dispute for leadership in Caracas. Well, the ELN and the FARC, who basically have all of their eggs in that basket on the Venezuelan side, they're not going to want to relinquish power just because a democratic regime is in Colombia. The sindicatos are not going to want to relinquish power. The National Guard units that have been on the take with criminal operations are not going to relinquish power. The colectivos, basically the kind of the neighborhood watch organizations, who are often far more armed than they are disciplined, again, are an unpredictable quantity. And so, basically the transition of power is really step one. I mean, this is highly armed, undisciplined, criminal, and it will explode. It will become the mother of all messes. And that will impact Colombia. It will impact the internal. So, that element of security reform is to me the most serious thing. But the broader security sector reform, and it's actually interesting, yes, actually Colombia has probably been one of our best allies in those type of things. The Colombians actually have their own Office of Forced Transformation and actually have some very good, essentially, transformation proposals of their own. Now, a lot of those have been completely short-circuited by the COVID crisis and the diversion of resources to the COVID response. But as I indicated before, the Colombians have been an instrumental partner for us, working to strengthen partner military institutions in El Salvador, other parts of Central America, et cetera, because, again, they have the linguistic skills, they have the professionalization. The ambassador mentioned programs like Acción Integral, integrating basically the exercise of military presence with the other organs of the state that allow you to establish that workable presence. So you're right, it's absolutely vital, whether it's in Venezuela or other parts of the region, because at the end of the day, if you don't have strong institutions, whether security institutions or others, nothing else that you do really has any staying power.
Well, everyone, that's a wrap. Thanks, Ambassador Ferrero and Professor Ellis, for joining us today on STRATEGIKON, and Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to you both.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you too.
Thank you.
Evan, thank you so much.
Thank you. Fue un gran gusto, embajador.
Let's keep in touch.
I will look forward to that, absolutely.
And to our audience, thanks for listening. We hope that you'll join us for our next exciting adventure through the world of geopolitics. Remember that you can subscribe to STRATEGIKON through the Ozcast network, iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Spotify. And please like us on the Sage International Australia Facebook site and follow us on Twitter. We appreciate your support. Also, please comment on any of our articles and podcasts through Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and of course on the Sage International Australia site. We welcome any constructive feedback that can help improve our products, and we look forward to engaging with our followers. If you would like to support Strategikon, remember to check out our merch page. We have a wide variety of items to keep the Strategikon listeners satisfied. As this is our final show for the year, we at Strategikon wish you a safe and happy Christmas and New Year's. May 2021 be a better year for us all. We'll be back in early January to explore the world of security and foreign affairs with you. Until next time, goodbye.
Oscast.
Who are dear to us, gather near to us once more, and through the years we all will be together if the fates allow. Hang a shining star among the highest bough, and have yourself a merry little Christmas now.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.